Hello, Bravs. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, Major General Frank Richardson. We start at Chapter 8. Napoleon and the Male Sex. Norwood Young, let's start over. Chapter 8, Napoleon and the Male Sex. Norwood Young, who made a very detailed study of Napoleon, believed that the many-sided nature of his character and achievements upsets people's mental processes and leads to the formulation of odd theories. To many readers, the suggestion of a homosexual component in Napoleon's nature will no doubt seem to be a very odd theory. My own researches had led me to the conclusion that Napoleon must have had homosexual tendencies, and I knew that he had been included in a list of homosexual monarchs compiled by the prolific writer and explorer Sir Richard Burton. But it was only after an extensive search through the Napoleonic literature that I learned from a contribution by Dr. N. Praetorius to the scientific journal Zeitschrift für Sexualwissenschaft. That itself sounds gay. In 1922, that the suggestion had been made by one or two writers. Allegations of various other sexual perversions were also mentioned in the article. Some of these can be dismissed as malicious propaganda, but hints of homosexuality were made by at least one authoritative contemporary, General Maximilian Foy, and were subsequently repeated by Dr. Cabanis and other medical writers. Dr. Praetorius comes down heavily, I might almost say ponderously, against the conclusion that Napoleon had homosexual tendencies. However, he examined only two friendships, with Duroc, the Grand Marshal of the Palace, and with the young Lacassus, whereas in this chapter I shall describe many more indications that such tendencies did exist. Let us begin with the two cases considered by Dr. Praetorius. Napoleon himself laid claim to only one great friendship when he said, "Friendship is only a name. I love nobody. I do not even love my brothers, except perhaps Joseph a little, from habit and because he is my elder. And Duroc, I love him too. But why? Because his character pleases me. He is stern and resolute, and I believe the fellow never shed a tear." Gerard Christophe Michael Duroc, Duke of Friuli, was 3 years younger than Napoleon, whose aide-de-camp he became in 1796 after first meeting his future emperor at Toulon. He distinguished himself in several actions, but it caused some consternation among more senior generals when, in 1805, Napoleon appointed his 33-year-old favorite to command Oudinot's famous division, the Grenadiers Oudinot, in Germany. Of course, Napoleon's generals and marshals were mostly very young, and Marshal Oudinot, who had been wounded, was only 38 at the time. But Duroc superseded many men much senior to him in the army. For 15 years, Duroc was Napoleon's most intimate confidant, not only in affairs of state, but in the most personal and private matters. He acted as go-between in many of Napoleon's love affairs, and after being appointed Grand Marshal of the Palace in 1804, it was his duty to supervise every detail of the emperor's living and working conditions, his safety, food, amusements, and social life. In the Tuileries, he had a small bedroom next to the emperor's, and they often used to take long walks incognito in the early hours of the morning. They had a private sign language used only between themselves, which, as I have said, struck Marie Waluska as rather schoolboyish. I don't remember reading that part, but all right. Savary, once one of Emperor's young aides-de-camp and also exceptionally privileged and patronized by him, described Duroc as the man who was the most necessary to the emperor, and wrote that after his death, Napoleon in moments of stress would actually cry out, "Ah, Duroc, Duroc!" Napoleon was not the only one who missed Duroc. Because of the complete trust which the emperor had in him, Duroc was often able to save both Napoleon and his potential victims from the worst excesses of his sudden outbursts of violent anger. After Napoleon became emperor, no one outside his family circle could tutor him except Duroc. Duroc and Napoleon were seldom separated, and at the end, Duroc was to receive a signal reward for his devotion. For his remains were buried in the Invalides, where he lies beside the emperor, whose coffin was brought there in 1840 from St. Helena. Duroc has often been described as being cold and even repelling in his demeanor. Napoleon knew better. Duroc, he said, had lively, tender, and concealed passions, little corresponding with the coldness of his manner. Napoleon told Lascases that Duroc was the only man who had possessed his intimacy and entire confidence. Lascases' own opinion was that Duroc loved the emperor for himself. It was rather to the individual personally that his devotion was attached than to the monarch. Napoleon's love for Duroc has never been questioned, but opinions have differed as to whether Duroc really liked the emperor or secretly disliked him, as some thought. Duroc was fatally wounded towards the end of the Battle of Bautzen. He himself replaced his bowels, which were lying on the ground. Lengthy and touching descriptions of a long visit by Napoleon to his dying friend, and of their conversation, which only ended when Duroc begged the emperor to leave, because his wound was of so distressing a nature, having been doubted by some historians who have held that Duroc was unconscious before Napoleon arrived. When informed that Duroc had been struck, Napoleon was aghast and incredulous. "Duroc! Impossible! He was at my side just now." What cannot be doubted is Napoleon's terrible grief after Duroc's death, and his strange and uncharacteristic behavior. He called off the action, and would see no one for the rest of that day and night. He later bought the farmyard where Duroc had died, and erected a monument there. Dr. Warden, the senior doctor of Northumberland, the ship which took Napoleon to St. Helena, was told by Madame Bertrand about Napoleon's extravagant grief after Duroc's death. He wrote that she represented Napoleon's grief as perfectly romantic, and stated as a fact that he lay, for it is not to be supposed that he slept, a whole night on the stone which covered the grave of his friend. Unusual conduct for a general at an important point in a campaign, and strangely reminiscent of the even more unbalanced behavior of Alexander the Great after the death of his favorite, Hephaestion. Louis Adolphe Thiers, the French politician and author of a massive history of the Consolidated Empire, a glorious period in this country's history which spanned the impressionable years of his own childhood and early youth, was 17 at the time of Duroc's death. He wrote of Napoleon's grief, his face bathed with tears as he sat on some fascines near an outpost, oblivious alike to the stray shots of skirmishers and a soldier's dog licking his hands, which lay listlessly on his knees. Thiers said that much speculation was aroused by certain dying words attributed to Duroc. I have nothing to reproach myself with. This was believed to be a reference to some unjust reproaches by Napoleon, who said Thiers did not spare even those who he esteemed the most. Perhaps the memory of a recent disagreement sharpened his sorrow. But whatever the reason, it was most unlike Napoleon to allow his grief for Duroc to interfere with his conduct of a campaign, and he was later to confess that his failure to exploit his victory at Bautzen had been the greatest mistake of his life. Was it because he had lost Duroc? Emile Ludwig clearly thought that it was, for he compared Napoleon's inaction on this occasion with his previous conduct, when he concealed his heartache and stormed onwards, even when he had lost his wife's love. Was his love for Duroc more important? Was it? The passage in General Foy's History of the Peninsular War, which has been interpreted as implying that the friendship between Napoleon and Duroc was a homosexual one, is on page 233 of the second volume. It was translated thus in 1827. No other person was entrusted with so many and such important political secrets. the turn of his mind, which had more correctness than profundity, his perfect steadiness, and more than all, the empire of habit, had placed him upon the footing of a privy confidant. Another name would have been given to the connection of Duroc with Napoleon, if a prince of his disposition could ever have a favorite. For Dr. Pretorius, much turns upon what General Foy may have meant by the word favori, which he believes conveys no sexual connotation except in relation to the mistresses or lady loves of sovereigns. In this, the doctor is not supported by Robert's French diction. All right, Dr. Pretorius is concerned to throw doubt on the possibility of a homosexual relationship of a physical sort between Napoleon and Duroc. I am sure that he is right to do so, and suggestions to the contrary were probably the evil work of scurrilous pamphleteers. It would have been quite alien to Napoleon's character to have stooped to sodomy. The same applies to many homosexual men who lead completely chaste lives. So the question, to which in any case we shall never know the answer, is an irrelevant one. However, I must disagree with Dr. Pretorius when he finds it absurd to suppose that even if Napoleon had had homosexual tendencies, he would have chosen for such a relationship a general of about his own age rather than a good-looking, effeminate youth. Hübsch, effeben, Weibenbollnox, Jungen. Medical experts who have attempted to analyze male homosexual attraction have found that just as men are attracted by different types of women, and are stimulated by different aspects of female anatomy, so it is quite erroneous to suppose that homosexual men are only attracted by the feminine type of man, still less by boys, an attraction which many of them regard as unsatisfactory, if not disreputable, perversion. Many seem to be drawn to rough, virile, even coarse-fibered males, so it is not out of the question that there may have been some homosexual element in Napoleon's devotion to Duroc. Much broader hints of homosexuality than those of General Foy are to be found in the article on Duroc in the biography universelle of Michaud, 1855, in which the term favori is, maybe I'm saying that wrong because it sounds very Italian. Favori is used rather pointedly 3 times. It includes the passage, "For 15 years he was constantly the confidant of the greatest projects and the smallest intrigues. He was even frequently the accommodating agent of the most secret pleasures of his master. Le ministère complaisant des plaisirs les plus secrets des hommes matures," because it gave scant regard to Duroc's military ability, and for its overt hostility, this Michaud biography was strongly denounced by A. Sauzet, the author of a longer article on Duroc in the Nouvelle biography of Dr. Hofer, 1856. Sauzet asserts that the Michaud biography of Duroc first appeared in 1814, which is interesting. Napoleon may not have been at the pinnacle of power at that time, but he still knew how to deal with hostile press. In 1811, the eccentric character Louis Goldsmith wrote very disparagingly of Duroc's ability, and to account for the emperor employing him in such responsible positions, said that the scandalous Chronicle of Paris accounts for it in a way which I think unfit to mention. We shall see later that Goldsmith was not always so mealy-mouthed about Napoleon's homosexual leanings, but he is not a man whose uncorroborated testimony should be accepted. He was at one time very friendly with Napoleon and Talleyrand in their pay, and writing pro-revolutionary propaganda, but he later changed sides. The ease with which Goldsmith seems to have been able to slip from France to England and back again suggests that he may have been some sort of double agent, but he certainly knew a great deal about the Bonapartes. The article in biography Michaud, written in 1814, makes it clear that scandal about Napoleon and Duroc was not only spread by people like Goldsmith. The nature and gradations of homosexuality had not been exhaustively explored in the 1920s when Dr. Pretorius wrote his article, so we might perhaps expect him to be more interested in the possibility that Napoleon's affection for young Lacasse was homosexually inspired. He wastes few words in dismissing that suggestion. When Emmanuel de Lacasse went with his father to share Napoleon's exile in St. Helena, he was about 15, if we accept Masson's version, and about 17 when he left the island. Dr. Pretorius gives the boy's age as 18, but Captain Maitland, who saw a lot of him aboard Bellerophon, thought that he was 13, so he may have looked younger than his real age. Naturally, the boy was infected by his father's worship of Napoleon, which amounted to idolatry. Some years later, after Napoleon's death, he assaulted Sir Hudson Lowe in a London street and tried to provoke him into fighting the duel. Finally, he was one of the party which returned to St. Helena to take Napoleon's body to Paris for reburial in the Invalides? I don't understand. I think that Dr. Pretorius was quite right to dismiss as unsubstantiated innuendo the insinuations that Napoleon's more or less paternal feelings for this boy were homosexually inclined. You think? He was 13 years old, buddy. It is surprising, however, that Dr. Pretorius, whilst writing about St. Helena, did not refer to the Gourgaud affair, about which the evidence is much more suggestive. His omission to do so can probably be accounted for by his assumption that Napoleon, if homosexual, would have been interested only in good-looking youths. Napoleon's nature and the circumstances of his life prevented him from being very companionable, and there was probably only one man who must have resented being left out of the list of those whom he loved. This was Baron Gaspard Gourgaud, a vain, touchy general 14 years younger than Napoleon, who in the course of quite a distinguished military career became one of Napoleon's orderly officers in April 1811. A year later, he was made first orderly officer, a newly created post which brought him into a most intimate relationship with Napoleon, which endured nearly 6 years. He claimed to have saved Napoleon's life in 1814, and the story, as he loved to tell it, went thus. At Brienne, I killed a Cossack who hurled himself at His Majesty in an attempt to run him through with a lance. Napoleon could always madden Gourgaud by pretending to remember nothing of this incident, which it is quite possible he really had not noticed. Gourgaud's name was not among those originally selected to accompany Napoleon to St. Helena, but he insisted on going, and it is well that he did so, for Lord Rosebery considered that Gourgaud's St. Helena journal is the richest source of information for historians of that period of Napoleon's life. This was before the discovery of the Cahiers de Saint Helene of Bertrand, to whom alone Lord Rosebery awarded the halo of fidelity. Praising him for one agreeable singularity, he published no book, which is in itself a pleasant contrast to the copious self-revelation of Gourgaud and Lacasse. Lord Rosebery wrote that Gourgaud was devoted to his master with an unreasonable, petulant jealousy, which made his devotion intolerable, and he added that the Napoleon of our preconceptions would have ordered a subordinate who talked to him as Gourgaud did out of the room before he had finished a single sentence. But Napoleon was always strangely disturbed by Gourgaud and irritated by his absurd jealousy. He really hated to hurt his feelings, and when he did so and Gourgaud was sulking, he went to great lengths to effect a reconciliation, pinching, caressing, and coaxing him, to use Gourgaud's own expression, and calling him my son Gourgaud, Gourgado, my little Gourgaud. He said of Gourgaud, he was my first orderly officer. He is my work. He is my son. He recognized that Gourgaud had an intense mother fixation, but hurt his feelings by impatiently telling him that he was mad to rave about his mother in such an unreasonable way. After Gourgaud left the island, Napoleon said, he loved me as a lover loves his mistress. He was impossible. Count Balmain, the Russian commissioner in St. Helena, said that Gourgaud was jealous of Napoleon as of a mistress. Hilaire Belloc, in his preface to the English translation of Gourgaud's journal, wrote, Gourgaud's attitude towards the emperor was more than admiration and adoration. It was exalted personal love filled with the highest degree of admiration. Maximilian Vox concludes that beneath Gourgaud's virile exterior lay a scarcely repressed hyper-feminine sense. Who thinks about this stuff this deeply? It's a bunch of fanboys here. And his adoration of the emperor was nothing but a repressed amorous passion. As for Napoleon's attitude, Vox believes that the boredom of St. Helena revived Napoleon's old curiosity about suffering and perceiving the nature of Gourgaud's affections. He could not resist treating him in a sadistic way, but let himself be caught in his own game, moreover, and ended up in a sort of unhealthy state of excitement, looking for sentimental quarrels. Fox finds that Gourgaud's accounts of these scenes are made piquant by the evident pleasure which he took in speaking whenever possible of the emperor in the feminine, carrying all the permutations of Sa Majesté to absurd lengths. The literal translation of one passage quoted by Vox is as follows: Her Majesty dines at home. She received the governor without being dressed, and swore to him that she would have been better treated had she surrendered to either Russia or Austria. Her Majesty grew angry, declared herself the mistress of her money. Yes, your Majesty is the mistress. Lord Rosebery, commenting on the strange and hopeless contradictions in the contemporary accounts, wrote, There seems to have been something in the air of St. Helena which blighted exact truth. One fact, however, is unquestioned. Gourgaud was insanely jealous of anyone who came between him and Napoleon or even diverted the emperor from fighting over again his old battles. After the departure of Las Casas, Gourgaud's hatred was concentrated upon the Montholons, and he warned the emperor against them. Napoleon teasingly asked him what business it would be of Gourgaud's if he chose to go to bed with Madame de Montholon, to which Gourgaud replied that he had never suspected the emperor of having so depraved a taste. He threatened to challenge de Montholon to a duel, which greatly angered Napoleon, who said that although Gourgaud was brave in battle, he could not stand the strain of St. Helena, and lost his mental balance. Others suggested that enforced chastity was at the root of the trouble, and Montholon, to Gourgaud's fury, urged him to pay court to various local ladies. The cause of Gourgaud's return to Europe has long been one of history's minor enigmas. He certainly became unbearably bored with conditions in St. Helena, where he quarreled with almost everyone. He longed to go home to see his mother, as he was morbidly obsessed by the fear that she might die before he could see her again. I mean, that's a legitimate concern, right? One theory is that the quarrel, which was the ostensible cause of his leaving Longwood, was a feigned one designed to make it possible for him to return to Europe, where he could carry out some sort of intrigue on Napoleon's behalf. Exhaustive research by Frederick Masson led him to doubt the existence of any such mission. Gourgaud was allowed to take the direct route to Europe, avoiding the long delay at the Cape, which had been imposed upon Las Casas, and the confidence with which the governor permitted this was justified. Gourgaud's statements in England tended to minimize Napoleon's sufferings and supported the governor's suspicions that he still nurtured hopes of departure from Longwood. In his embarkation, he was frequently questioned by the governor and the commissioners of the Allied powers, all eager to find out what went on behind Napoleon's closed doors. The Marquis de Montchenu shrewdly discerned that it would take little to make the impetuous, disturbed man lose all sense of what it was decent to say and not to say. Tortured by his conscience for having abandoned the master he idolized, to whom he had consecrated his whole existence, as he said in his letter of farewell, he did indeed seem to lose all sense of propriety. As Ralph Korngold put it, when Gourgaud's pathological love for Napoleon turned to hatred, he made revelations which no honorable man would have made. As if to make Count Ballman believe that he really had turned against the emperor, he told him that when Napoleon had said that if he ever got to Europe, Gourgaud must join him, he had replied that he would meet him with a double-barreled gun. To account for his leaving, the emperor told the governor, I can no longer live there with honor. I have been treated like a dog. He wished me to do things contrary to my honor, or forced me by bad treatment to leave him. Next day he wrote that, like many others in St. Helena, he had been troubled by dysentery, to which had recently been added afflictions of a moral nature. After leaving Longwood, he wrote in his journal that the Marquis of Montchenu had congratulated him having broken his fetters, and he added, Alas, I have only broken my moral fetters that weighed most heavily on me. He even went so far as to threaten blackmail. You might remind Bertrand that I am in a position to play the Emperor a scurvy trick, if I were so inclined, that I could reveal a good many secrets. My Longwood diary would be worth £15,000 in London. He had better not go too far. Napoleon dismissed this remarkable threat with these equally remarkable words. Speak to me no more of that man. He is mad. He was jealous, in love with me. Qui diable? I'm not his wife and can't sleep with him. I know he will write these things about me, but I don't care. If he is received in France, he will be shut up, hanged, or shot. Whilst Napoleon thus seemed to be serenely aloof and untroubled by the threatened revelations, others at Longwood were worried on his behalf and their own about the lengths to which Gourgaud's garrulous mischief-making might go. Dr. O'Meara, already quarreling with the governor, had not long to wait, and was soon himself expelled from Longwood. Montholon knew that he and his wife would not be spared the frustrated bachelor's venom, but it was Bertrand, Grand Marshal of the Palace, who knew just what to expect. He did not live in Longwood, and was able to steer clear of most of the petty squabbles brewed in that overcrowded house. He had patiently tried to keep the peace, and had prevented Gourgaud fighting his duel with Montholon. He had begged Gourgaud to have patience, and speaking from personal experience, told him that they all knew what the emperor was like. Gourgaud only needed to be patient, to make himself useful and pleasant to the emperor, and his turn to be in favor would come again. After one of these talks, Gourgaud wrote in his journal, as quoted by de Langle in his edition of Bertrand's diary, I open my heart to Bertrand. Bertrand repeats that I have only to please, that it depends on me. Have I a to please? I don't know what the heck that means. Dr. Garnier writes that this remark, Agi in aussi habler, was coarsely hurled at Bertrand, and he commenced, Jusqu'où alors des start continue. When the final rupture had become inevitable, Bertrand urged Gourgaud to make reasons of health the excuse for his departure, but Gourgaud would have none of this, and retorted that if he had to write to the emperor, it would be to say that he could not be at the order of his si och order de sech. He said that the emperor wanted to make it appear that Gourgaud was abandoning him, whereas, in fact, he was being chased away. Those who are not acquainted with French obscenities must accept the assurance of those who are that these strange utterances reinforce our suspicions of an unnatural relationship. They are at least extremely odd things that have been said by Gourgaud about his hero. And we will stop there. Goodbye, Bravs. Goodbye.